The best items in Diablo 2 are found from monsters and other bosses, but what if you completely ignored all of that hard-earned treasure and instead relied completely on Charsi, Gheed and the other vendors to gear you up? In this video I will try and beat Diablo 2 while only using gear that I buy from vendors in town. I will try and beat every difficulty of the game from normal to hell. I can put both gems and runes into sockets on my gear, but I'm not allowed to make rune words. You can buy non-magic socketed items early on in the game, but it doesn't fit the spirit of the challenge in my opinion. And this might seem obvious since they aren't sold by any vendor, but I'm not allowed to use charms. I also made some additional rules that doesn't involve vendors. The original suggestion for this challenge also stipulated that I did it as a melee build, which I like even though it makes it a lot harder since I think gear buying decisions will be more interesting for a melee character. For a mercenary, I'm only allowed to use the rogues from Act 1 or Iron Wolves from Act 3. And finally, because they are cool and I never get to use them, I decided to only use two-handed swords. Now that's a lot of restrictions, but they should all be pretty straightforward to follow. So let's create our hero and get going. I think the Paladin would have been the strongest melee character for this challenge, but I've been using him a lot lately, so instead I opted to go with the Barbarian. I started out by having a friendly chat with Charsi.
Wow, you're a barbarian, huh?
I sold her my starting axe and shield as a friendly gesture to facilitate future trade deals and then headed out into the Bloodmoor. The Barbarian's fists were powerful enough to take care of the early enemies, while I tried to scrape together enough gold for some initial starting gear. In the beginning, I picked up almost every piece of trash that had a sell value. Otherwise, a good rule of thumb is that body armor that looks like it's made out of metal, as well as scepters, wands and staves with +2 skills are the most valuable items to sell. Early on, throwing weapons, throwing potions, charms and jewelry also sells for a lot of gold relative to how much space they take up in your inventory. After clearing out the Den of Evil, I headed back to town with an inventory full of stuff to sell. I bought a belt to hold more potions as well as some random armor pieces as placeholders, mostly to fill those gear slots so that I would not equip any loot that I pick up from the ground on accident. I also wanted to buy a two-handed sword, but it turned out that those can't even show up in the trade window until level 5, so I went and punched some more monsters and then gave it another try. I found a magical one with enhanced damage and chance to cast amplify damage. That seemed really strong at first glance, but from my experience the 5% chance to cast the curse isn't something you can really rely on, especially with the short curse duration at level 1. Perfectly decent for a first weapon though, and wearing two-handed swords does indeed look really cool. I kept going for a while, repeated the Forgotten Tower and the Countess a few times, and saved up as much gold as I could. As I leveled up to level 12, I found my first unique item, and since the loot gods of Diablo 2 have a sick sense of humor, they gave me a Pelta Lunara, a great melee shield for the early game, which of course I couldn't use in this playthrough, so I pawned it for some gold and decided to try and buy some upgrades instead. I had to do a lot of reading online to figure out how the game decides what kind of items you can buy and what stats they can roll with. If you're really interested, I will put some links to the best resources I found on the topic in the description of the video, but here's all you need to know to follow along in the video. All items have a hidden property called the item level, or eye level for short. When buying things from vendors, the eye level depends on your character's level. For gambled items, the eye level will be random in a range from your character's level -5 to +4, and for items offered in the trade window, the eye level will be your character's level +5, except that in normal difficulty there is a hard eye level cap in each act. But then things become a little complicated, because what stats are available at a certain item level is different for different items. As a general rule of thumb, lower tiers of items can get more powerful stats earlier. Like a hand axe can get the brutal affix for up to 50% enhanced damage at eye level 15, meaning you could start seeing it at vendors from level 10, while it's not available on war axes until eye level 26 or character level 21. Also, stats on items are called affixes in Diablo 2. It's not important, but I use the terms interchangeably in the video just so you know what I'm talking about. With my new knowledge, I tried finding an upgrade for my sword. After a few rerolls of Charsi's inventory, I managed to buy a deadly two-handed sword of maiming, which was one of the better damage rolls available at this point. Then I tried to gamble leather gloves and boots, hoping to get the off-chance affix for increased magic find. I wasn't allowed to wear gear that I found, but magic items have a higher sell value, so more magic find would mean more gold. Gambling for specific stats can be very expensive, but at this low level the available affixes are not that many for leather gloves and boots, so I find that I can usually gamble these fairly easily. I also got a pair of rare boots with faster run walk and 8 in fire resist, which might come in handy later when I need a bit more actual stats from my boot slot, so I saved those in the stash for now. I couldn't afford much else after that, so the rest of my gear had to stay the same for now. Since shopping is so limited in Act 1 due to the item level cap, I tried rushing for Act 2 as fast as possible. So in hindsight, it was probably a mistake to spend that much gold on the boots, since you can just buy boots and gloves with Magic Find in Act 2 anyway. I wasn't very tanky yet, but as long as I didn't get myself surrounded by too many monsters at once, things were manageable. My damage was good, and as weird as it sounds, I got used to the complete lack of area damage pretty quickly, and it didn't bother me that I had to slash enemies one at a time. I hit level 15 right before Andariel, and before fighting her I hired my first mercenary. The only reason I hadn't done so earlier was simply because I forgot about it because I thought so much about shopping. I bought her some basic gear and an 8-pack of antidote potions before I headed down into the catacombs. Between me, my mercenary, and a lot of potions, Andariel was defeated on the first try without much trouble. Now that I was in Act 2, a lot more gear options had opened up. Act 2 raises the item level cap from vendors from 12 to 20, and since I was already level 15, items at the trade windows were already at the cap. Farah was now offering to sell me claymores, which attack a bit slower than two-handed swords, but deal a lot more damage. I didn't bother looking too long for the best possible stats, but instead bought the first decent looking one that showed up, and this one was fine, literally. I bought a pair of gloves with Magic Find and a little bit of lightning resist. I upgraded my boots for a bit more Magic Find. I bought a helm with chance to cast Frost Nova when hit, thinking it would be decent crowd control with a big AoE cold damage. I also bought a belt of Frost Nova that also could hold more potions. I let my body armor stay as it was for now, since it was socketed with 2 chipped topazes for a little bit of Magic Find. I also bought some plain socketed items for later, since Act 2 normal was my last chance to buy socketed non-magical items from vendors. Magic items can have sockets too, but it's much more rare to shop for those than the non-magical ones. The breastplates in particular were quite expensive, so I was left with just a few thousand golds after my shopping spree. My mercenary had to stick with her scrappy gear for the time being, as I started feeling a little bit cheap with my gold. This wasn't a fast character, but I never expected him to be. I was balancing between trying to push on as fast as possible to unlock new shoppable items in the next act with collecting enough loot to sell for gold to be able to afford them, so I chugged along at a steady pace. I checked in with Farah every time I went to town on a quest-related matter and managed to score an upgrade for my gloves. I also found an upgrade for my weapon, and if I read my affixes correctly, this is one of the best damage rolls I could possibly buy on a claymore in Act 2. High enhanced damage roll and high max damage roll. If you feel like Diablo 2 has gotten a bit stale, I can highly recommend you try this challenge, because it's very refreshing to be like hell yeah and make a fist pump in the air for a vicious claymore of slaying. I completed the quests of Act 2 without running into too much trouble, and just as I was about to face Duriel, I hit level 21 and 100,000 gold in my stash. That was just enough to gamble 2 rings, and that was very tempting since they were guaranteed to be upgraded since my ring slots were currently empty, and while I could potentially get a ring with a good boost to attack rating, resists or lifesteal, I could just as well end up with faster cast rate or +2 light radius. Since I was so close to Act 3, I decided to hold on to my gold for the rest of the act. The Duriel fight in normal is always tough for any character, but I managed to defeat him on the first try. It was a close fight though, as I drank my last health potion just before he died. I would have to start focusing a bit more on improving my defenses soon, because while my damage felt fine, I was not able to out-heal damage from difficult enemies with potions, and running away from combat as a barbarian just feels wrong. My first order of business in Act 3 was to replace my mercenary. I hired a Fire Iron Wolf, mostly for his enchant spell to boost my attack rating. In Act 3, the item level cap increases to 25, and several new items were available from the vendors. I was mostly interested in Heratli, who now sold both giant swords and bastard swords, though it was a bit of a pain to reroll his trade window because of where he is located. It wasn't going to be easy to replace the vicious claymore of slaying, but I spent some time at the beginning of the act looking for gear upgrade. I ended up finding a bastard sword with a decent roll. It had slightly lower max damage, but the minimum damage was way higher, so it ended up being a decent upgrade for my average damage per swing. I also bought a helm with some attack rating and replaced my Magic Find boots with the rare boots with fire resist that I gambled in Act 1. I kept my belt with chance to cast Frost Nova, and I also didn't upgrade my armor, even though it felt like it could use an upgrade. The stats on the armors that the vendors were offering were not that appealing to me, and all body armors were terribly expensive. My mercenary got my old helm, a sword with a little bit of resist, and a socketed bone shield with 2 flawed diamonds for resist. The jungle wasn't particularly difficult. Monsters died in a hit or two from my sword, and my mercenary dealt good damage too, with the splash damage from his fireball spell being a welcome addition. I still wasn't as tanky as I would have liked, but it didn't hold me back, and I progressed through the quests of Act 3 at a perfectly decent pace. I collected Kalim's eye, then his brain, and finally his heart, and soon found myself in Travancore. I struggled a bit against the council despite having decent fire resist, and had to retreat to town to buy more potions and resurrect my mercenary a few times, but I eventually managed to take them down by luring them out of the temple a few at a time. Before I headed down into the Durance of Hate, I decided to finally try and gamble some circlets, and I'm not sure why I hadn't done so earlier. I felt some strange need to keep growing my gold pile bigger and bigger, but the stash gives no interest, and the stats available on circlets are very good as soon as you start seeing them in the trade window, so a few more levels wouldn't really matter, and if anything it just made them more expensive to gamble. The thing I was looking for the most was elemental damage, since the rolls that can spawn on circlets early in the game are relatively high. After just a handful of gambles, I managed to get a rare one with cold resist and a bunch of other useful stats. Very nice. Now it wasn't perfect, but it was very solid for this point in the game, and I was happy to wear it for the time being. Since I had the gold to spare, I also gambled 2 rings and an amulet. I didn't get anything special, but at least they were all technically upgrades over, well, nothing. At least I had now filled every equipment slot. I've been focusing only on my gear so far, so here's what my skill build looked like before taking on Mephisto. I had 10 points into Sword Mastery and a single point in the other passives. I was working towards Berserk, which I was planning to use as my main skill, and for now I occasionally used Concentrate and Leap. Howl, Taunt and Battle Cry are all great support skills, and I just unlocked Battle Orders where I was going to put most of my skill points next. As for Mephisto, as soon as I managed to get him alone without any other monsters, he was more annoying than difficult. Mephisto dropped 2 unique items for me to sell, a Stout Nail and a Diggler. In Act 4 I could start seeing some high single resist rolls show up on several items, as well as other useful stats. I really wanted to increase my fire and lightning resist before taking on the Chaos Sanctuary and Diablo, but I was still poor from gambling my crappy jewelry, so I had to continue my quest for now and gather a bit more gold. And getting a few more levels would also help with my shopping, since I was only level 25 and the item level cap in Act 4 36. The first half of the act went smoothly, with the only real danger being the Pit Lords and their Fire Breath attack, but only if I stood still and got hit by multiple of them at once. I went to sell some loot and repair my gear and found an armor with 30 fire resist and some life. This was exactly the kind of armor I was looking for, and I could afford it too. Later in the River of Flame I found Saigon's belt, which would have been a nice belt for this character if I would have been allowed to use it. But Halbo took pity on me, and after I sold Saigon's belt to him, he offered to sell me a belt with 25% lightning resist, which I bought and equipped. I then did the Hellforge quest, which only gave me a Thal rune, finished the rest of the River of Flame and leveled up just as I entered the Chaos Sanctuary. Though I had been able to buy some decent upgrades for my resistances, they were not as high as I would have liked, but I decided to try and push on anyway. Now you might be thinking, hey, if you need resistances, why don't you just put some runes in the 3-socketed breastplate that you bought in Act 2? That's a great idea. It also crossed my mind, but I simply didn't have the right runes. I had a single Ral and no Ort runes. And going back now to grind the Countess just wasn't what this playthrough was about for me. The Chaos Sanctuary was a spike in difficulty as expected. Curses, ranged magic attacks and fast monsters trying to surround me. It was a grind to get through the seals, but not much interesting happened. I took it slow and steady, tried to not engage too many enemies at once, and retreated back to town several times to buy more potions. Diablo's fire attacks didn't do as much as I thought they would, but then again I did have over 50% fire resist. His lightning attack, however, was absolutely deadly. It's not too difficult to avoid if you run away from it, but my slow attack animation made this part really difficult. If I was a bit slow to react or a bit unlucky with the timing, I stood still in his lightning attack for a little while before my character finished his attack swing and could start running. This actually caused me to die a few times during the fight, and slow animations are one of the most frustrating parts of Diablo 2 in my opinion, especially when playing a melee character. But after not too long of a fight, Diablo went down. I was looking forward to doing some shopping with Larsuk since my research told me that he could offer some real good items. But I didn't do it right away because at the very least I wanted to have a waypoint to reroll his inventory easier since the main gate in Harrogath is kind of out of the way. And I wanted to be a bit higher level to unlock some better stats on his items. I stopped to grind Eldritch and Shenk for a while for more gold and experience, and it really was a grind because I was struggling. I was only hitting monsters about 60% of the time, even with enchant from my mercenary. I wasn't 1 or 2 hitting even regular monsters anymore, and I could not soak up much damage at all. For the time being, my mercenary carried a lot of weight on his shoulders, but hopefully a few extra levels would help. During this grind session I found a green pair of gauntlets. That's Saigon's gloves, and how amazing would the combination of this and the Saigon's belt that I found before have been for this character. The stats are decent on their own, but I would have gotten 30% increased attack speed and 10% lifesteal as a set bonus. Yes, 30% attack speed. The Diablo loot gods were really trolling me in this run. After about an hour or so of grinding, I hit level 30, and those extra levels made a big difference for my chance to hit enemies. Lesson learned, don't run around under-leveled as a melee barbarian. Level 30 also unlocked Berserk, Battle Command and Natural Resistance, and I gained a few more levels of battle orders. I felt much stronger already, but the grind also gave me a lot of extra gold, so I spent some time looking for upgrades at Larsuk. I found a belt with a little bit more lightning resist and a decent chunk of life, and I also bought a new sword. The raw damage was a little lower than my current one, but it attacked a lot faster, so I figured my total damage output would be higher. Since I still had a lot of gold left over, I tried gambling some gloves and got a really nice pair of rares. Attack speed, resists and even some attack rating. Great stuff. I only wish the attack speed roll was higher. I also gambled boots and found a pair that looked like a decent upgrade, but I saved my old ones in the stash just in case I would need the fire resist later. Finally, I decided to try my luck with some jewelry again, and I ended up with an amulet with 7 strength, which was better than the 2 dexterity, but not really worth all of that gold. With all of those upgrades and levels, Act 5 was pretty smooth all of a sudden. Attacking faster and hitting more often felt so good, it was like I was playing a completely different character. I saved the barbarians, rescued Anya and made my way to the Ariat summit.
The guardians of Mount Ariat await.
The ancients were actually a lot easier than I thought they would be, and I managed to defeat them without much trouble on the first try. The throne room also started out pretty easy, until the final wave that is. Between Bale casting the Crepify and all minions being able to knock you back, I was starting to think that the developers must have hated male characters. I eventually managed to create some space between us and had to resort to luring them out one by one and positioning myself so that they would knock me back into a wall or a pillar, because for some reason their attacks doesn't knock you back and interrupt your attacks unless you're actually pushed back. This was by far the greatest challenge in a while, but I could grind through it slowly and eventually defeated them all. And as it often happens in challenge runs, Bale wasn't actually that bad after having suffered through the final wave in the throne room. Sure, it took like 5 minutes to wear him down, but he never put me or my mercenary in any real danger. After defeating Bale, I decided to stop and grind for several more levels in normal difficulty before moving on to Nightmare. I was constantly thinking about how to best spend my gold and what items to look for next, but as the Bale runs got progressively easier and easier as I leveled up, I started to wonder if some of the time I spent refreshing the vendors' inventories would have been better spent farming some levels instead. But as I'm running back to the throne room from the waypoint in shame, I want to point out that I said easier, not easy. When I hit level 40, I decided to move on since that allowed me to hit the item level cap for vendors in Act 5 in normal. I visited Larsuk and decided to spend a little bit of time here to make sure I had a good sword with 2 stats. I ended up picking up a Soldier's Greatsword of Slaying. The damage roll wasn't the highest I could find at this point, but it was still a big upgrade from my current sword. The Greatsword has great damage, but high stat requirements. Luckily, I had saved up most of the stat points while grinding for levels, so I didn't need to wait to equip it. And the Greatsword looks pretty damn cool if you ask me. I was still not happy with my jewelry, so despite the high cost, I tried again to gamble with the gold I acquired through grinding levels. I finally got a bit of luck with my jewelry, getting some rings with attack rating, including a rare one with lifesteal, attack rating and some other minor stats. Though I would soon learn the hard way that lifesteal does not work with Berserk at all, since it converts all of your damage into magic. And for an amulet, I got one with plus 12 to all resistances. It wasn't anything amazing, but for the first time I didn't feel like my jewelry was complete trash. When I entered Nightmare, my resistances were okay, but not great, and my mercenary hadn't had an upgrade in a while either. But I honestly wasn't really sure what to get for him, so I just took one of the 3-socketed shields that I bought in Act 2 normal and put all my best diamonds in it. That was enough for him to get max resistances in Nightmare, so I left the rest of his gear alone for now. I had finally found some more mid-level runes, so I made myself a fire and lightning resist armor with one of the breastplates that I also bought in Act 2 normal. So when going into Nightmare, this is what my character looked like. My weapon was my new Soldier's Greatsword of Slaying. My helm was still the rare circlet that I gambled earlier, and while the cold damage was not that big of a deal anymore, all of the other small stats combined still made it a solid helm, especially the mana to be honest, since the Barbarian's natural mana pool is so tiny. The resist amulet I just got, the armor that I just made, the rare gloves with attack speed, and this was the equipment that I needed to repair the most frequently, since it just had 12 durability. The new ring with attack rating, the belt with lightning resistant life, the rare ring that I just got, and the rare boots from earlier. Overall I was pretty happy with my gear for what it was, and I began making my way through Nightmare. Between the extra levels and my recent gear upgrades, Act 1 was a piece of cake. Well, I use that expression very generously here, but compared to what most of the game had felt like so far, it was nice to feel like I was playing an actual hero for once. But this character's strength was not clearing big groups of enemies, so I ran past a lot of regular monsters, only stopping for elite packs or monsters who blocked the way. I then spent some time at the Countess in the Forgotten Tower looking for Shale runes and Soul runes. Shale for the potential of giving me attack speed in weapon sockets, and Soul runes for the physical damage reduction, because in Nightmare I quickly learned that physical damage was a big weakness for this character, especially with no shield for blocking and Berserk setting my defense to 0. While farming the Countess, I found even more gear from the Saigon set from an elite enemy. That's the third Saigon's piece. Why doesn't this ever happen in my other playthroughs? While in town to sell off some loot, I randomly saw a claymore with almost 200% enhanced damage. This caught me a little bit off guard because I hadn't checked what items could spawn in a while, and apparently a lot of really good damage stats were starting to become available from vendors around my current level. I wasn't expecting to replace the greatsword so soon, but a gear upgrade was always welcome. After finding some of the runes I was looking for, I finished the rest of Act 1 and took down Andariel. In Act 2 I started using Leap a lot more often to skip past enemies that I didn't want to fight. In the Maggot Lair I jumped over most enemies except elite monsters, and in the Claw Viper Temple I believe I jumped over every single one. In the Arcane Sanctuary I started out doing the same, but then realized that it was probably not a bad area to fight in, considering the layout and the types of enemies that spawn here, and it was probably a good idea to catch up on some of the lost experience from skipping so much of the early parts of the act. This would become the playstyle of this character going forward, leaping through areas that were annoying for him to deal with and then stopping to do a bit of extra farming in areas that suited him better. It kind of reminded me of a scuffed version of how I usually played the Sorceress. Before Duriel I tried to do some shopping at Farah. I found a sword with the best enhanced damage stat available at this level coupled with attack speed, but the roll was unfortunately really low, so I wasn't even sure if it was worth it. I got tired of shopping rather quickly and soon moved on, but at least I managed to buy a pair of gloves with 20% attack speed. I felt a little lost on what to do. Should I try to buy upgrades now? Should I wait a few more levels? Should I gamble? I wasn't really feeling stuck at the moment, and I had spent so much time shopping already, so I decided to try and push on as far as possible and then reevaluate once progress became slower. Duriel dealt a lot of damage at a fast rate, but not fast enough to outdamage the constant healing from my potions. I had to go back to town to restock my belt once, but all in all, he didn't pose much of a challenge. In Act 3 I continued to push on as fast as I could, leaping over enemies to grab the eye, the brain and the heart. I said I was going to hold off on shopping to save some gold, but against better judgment I gambled a few circlets, a decent chunk of gold down the drain, and unfortunately I didn't get any good ones. The High Council of Travancore were quite dangerous in Nightmare, but I lured them out one by one with taunt. Luckily not a lot of other enemies spawned outside in front of the temple, and the council members are really not that strong unless they're together. I howled my way through the Durance of Hate and soon jumped on Mephisto. I had managed to keep my resistances decently high in Nightmare, so this fight wasn't too difficult. Progress had been really fast so far in Nightmare, but in Act 4 things started to slow down a bit. The act started off okay, but now I started to really struggle against physical damage, which forced me to take on fewer enemies at a time, leading to slower progress. I really wanted to get to Act 5 before I stopped to farm again, so I tried to push through even though every fight was a grind. And things got even worse once I made it to the Chaos Sanctuary, lots of physical damage and the extremely annoying curses. I relied heavily on my work price for crowd control, spamming Howl if I accidentally attracted too many enemies, and Taunt to pull enemies away from bigger packs a few at a time. I think Taunt is a really underappreciated skill, not only for this purpose, but also to force ranged units to stop attacking and walk towards you. But of course, the ranged knights who cast the curses are immune to it. It was quite slow and boring to play like this, but for the time being it was necessary. I finished up the seals and took on Diablo, and since they messed up his lightning attack in Nightmare and Hell so that it doesn't hit you if you stand really close to him, the fight was easier in Nightmare than it was in normal. I had to go to town a few times to buy more potions, but otherwise I could just stand there with my left mouse button held down, drink potions and wait for my inevitable victory. Once I reached Act 5, the need for both gear and levels had become an urgent issue, but I had spent almost all of my remaining gold on potions and mercenary revives in Act 4, so I could not really afford to buy anything. I jumped to the first waypoint and started to farm Eldritch, and I stayed here for quite a while. He and his buddies were not too difficult, they spawn very close to the waypoint, and there are rarely any other surprises like other elites spawning nearby. This provided good experience and a steady supply of loot that I could sell for gold. In between runs I would check in with the merchants to see if they had any interesting items for sale. Pretty early on I scored a significant sword upgrade with this ferocious greatsword, allowing me to break 1k max damage for the first time. I also mixed in a bit of gambling and decided to focus on trying to improve my boots first, but as I really needed a rare pair for an upgrade, I went and spent piles of a few 100,000 gold several times with nothing to show for it. But after a while my gambling finally paid off with a pair of rare boots with dual resist. This was probably going to be my boots for the rest of the game, as upgrading these would be tough. I bought some body armor with 3 open sockets and some minor magic damage reduction. I was relying heavily on the resist of my current armor, but I really wanted to get some physical damage reduction, and soul rune socketed in armor was probably my best chance to get some. I put it in the stash for now though, since I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to put in it. After gambling my rare boots, I decided to try for a better belt, and this time I got a bit luckier and got a dual resist rare in the first gambling session. Some other notable items from gambling was a pretty good rare ring to replace the one I got earlier with lifesteal and this magical circlet. Now it wasn't amazing or anything, but perhaps if Lursa could give it 2 sockets I could make something good out of it. Overall I was pretty happy with the gambling. I appreciate it, Nilatak. Now don't go and do anything evil while I'm gone, will ya? But as my mood got a little too good, the game decided to bring me back down and dropped a really good unique sword. Head Striker. This is a really good item, and in another playthrough I would probably have used this for the rest of the game. I admired it for a while, but alas. This was the short version of my side quest at Eldritch. I farmed him until I reached level 60, which took several hours. My character came out much stronger from it, but I was not expecting to having to do this much grinding, especially not in Nightmare. But I guess such is the fate of a self-found melee barbarian. Before moving on, I ended up socketing the circlet at Larsuk, but it unfortunately only got 1 socket. In hindsight, it might have been a waste of a socketing quest even if it would have gotten 2 sockets, but I still had the one from normal difficulty saved if I needed it later. I ended up putting a soul rune into it and 2 other soul runes plus an ort rune into the body armor. Thanks to the gear upgrades as well as being a bit over-leveled from the grind, the rest of Nightmare went rather smoothly as long as I didn't do anything stupid and put myself in too dangerous of a situation. Taking on this many claw vipers at once made me feel really powerful, though I do recognize that Howl was pulling a lot of weight here. I rescued Anya, defeated the Ancients, and made it to the throne room without any problems. The throne room proved to be a challenge though. Between cold damage and Bale's curse, I could barely move. One glaring issue that I had was that I did not have a source of cannot be frozen, so any cold damage was a major pain. But as far as I know, the only way I could ever get it from vendors was from getting very lucky and gambling a set or unique, so I assumed I would have to live without it. But by staying back away from the throne where Bale couldn't reach me with his curse sets and luring the difficult monsters out a few at a time, I eventually defeated all of the waves and got to face Bale himself. Between his cold damage, his knockback, his mana burn and teleporting around, he made the fight quite annoying. But to be honest, it wasn't too difficult and soon I had defeated Nightmare. But there was no doubt that the real challenge was still ahead of me. I started Hell by clearing out the Den of Evil to get a feel for how powerful and tanky I was. While fighting this group of Fallen, everything looked fine. My damage was fine, I tanked their damage not great but okay, but these were regular Fallen, perhaps the weakest enemy I will ever encounter, and on top of that, my resists were barely positive. This was not going to work, I needed another power boost. Most of my items were already decent, so upgrades wouldn't come easy, but what I really needed was a shield. I had been trying to stick to two-handed swords for as long as possible, but I really felt like a shield to block some of the physical damage would be a big upgrade for me. It would also be another gear slot for potential extra stats like life or resists. And you know, the barbarian can wield two-handed swords in one hand, so I could technically keep using two-handed swords even if I started using a shield. It wasn't my intention when I started this challenge, but at this point it felt like a necessity. Both Charsi and Gheed often have a big selection of shields in their trade windows, so I stayed in Act 1 Hell for a while and found a Mechanic's Tower Shield of blocking. The sockets could mean extra resist or damage reduction via runes, and the bonus to blocking is a great stat on shields. I would have been willing to settle for this shield, but I decided to look a little bit longer and managed to find an Artisan's Tower Shield of blocking, with one additional socket. Very nice, this was probably one of the better shields I could have found from a vendor. I was also checking out their weapons, and while I didn't find an upgrade for my main weapon, I found a maul with +2 to war cries which I put on my weapon switch for when casting battle orders and battle command. I don't think I have ever used a maul as a pre-buffing weapon switch before, but why not? After looking up what stats and items I could find, I decided to go back and level up a bit more in Nightmare to open up some better gear stats. I started by going back and doing the Nightmare Hellforge, which gave me an armor room which was quite lucky. I then farmed terror zones in Nightmare all the way up to level 70. It took a couple of hours, but thanks to terror zones it wasn't too bad. I managed to keep myself from gambling any of my gold for once, and ended up with a pile of over 1 million gold. One of the reasons why I leveled up was to have the ability to see armors with 4 sockets. Almost immediately I found a jeweler's full plate mail at Larsuk, which I bought just in case I wouldn't find any better, but I was willing to try a bit longer, hoping for one with a secondary stat as well. I bought 2 helms, 1 crown with 3 sockets and life, and 1 crown with 3 sockets and faster hit recovery. I also found this teaser of a gothic plate, with sockets and close to perfect life roll, but unfortunately only 3 sockets. I was hoping to find an exceptional sword with a high damage roll, but that was going to be really rare, so I wasn't going to be too picky. After maybe 30 minutes at Larsuk, I found a cruel greatsword of performance. Now it wasn't an exceptional sword, but the greatsword has such high damage compared to other normal swords, it might as well be exceptional. It was a big damage upgrade compared to my current one, so I decided to pick it up. And shortly after that find, I saw this jeweler's full plate mail of protection. It wasn't much of a secondary stat, but it was something. Actually, it was exactly the secondary stat I was hoping for, but of course I wished for a higher roll. But I was kind of fed up with refreshing the vendors' inventories at this point, so I settled for that one. I decided to gamble gloves with all of my leftover gold, hoping for a pair of rares with attack speed and some additional bonuses. But I didn't get there this time. And finally I went back to Larsuk in normal and used my last socket in quest on my new sword. It fortunately got 2 sockets this time, so this was probably going to be my weapon for a while, maybe for the rest of the game. Then it was time to figure out how to make the most out of these items. I had a lot of open sockets to fill and a lot of options. I started by putting my best diamonds into the shield for a nice boost to all resistances. I then put a Ral and 3 Ort runes into my body armor, which more or less maxed my fire and lightning resists. In my helm I put a Thal rune to max my cold resist, and then my very last soul rune for some physical damage reduction. I left the final socket in the helm empty for now, hoping to add another soul rune later if I would find one. And after looking up the barbarian's attack speed breakpoints, I put 2 shale runes into my sword for an additional 40% attack speed. I actually forgot to take into account that battle command raises the level of natural resistance, so my resist ended up being a bit overstacked even. Except poison of course, but I was content on relying on antidotes if I needed to. Max resistances and max block chance should make a big difference, and my damage was still quite good even though I was now wearing my sword in one hand instead of 2. I did have a lot more attack speed now though, so my total damage output should be higher. And if I didn't feel like I needed the shield, I did have the option to unequip it and wield the sword in 2 hands for extra damage. I had to respec to put stats into dexterity to increase my chance to block, and I guess I haven't really shown my skill build in a long time, but I was using a straightforward build with max berserk and its synergies, with 1 point into the last 4 passives, taunt and battle cry, and the rest into sword mastery. It would take a lot to upgrade this gear further, so I was really hoping it would be enough, and at least for the time being, it definitely was. The upgrades made a very big difference, both to my defense but also offensively. I attacked so much faster now. I was able to play a bit more aggressively again, leaping on top of elite enemies and then using Howl to isolate them, allowing me to take out the most dangerous enemies first. At this point I was completely sold on Howl. What a great crowd control skill. I headed straight for Andariel, skipping all optional quests. Well, I did rescue Kain even though it is technically not required. It just feels wrong to leave him in a cage in Tristram like that. As it became clear that I would beat Andariel fairly easily, I started to regain my confidence that I could perhaps beat this challenge. This felt great, as if nothing could stop me now. Act 1 was a piece of cake. Again, I'm using that phrase very generously in this video. I knew that the last 2 acts were going to be the real challenge, so I tried rushing through the next 2 acts as fast as I could. I will cover these acts very briefly in the video, but in reality it took several hours per act, even when I tried rushing through them. Attacking just a single enemy at a time was starting to get a bit stale. I also didn't do any shopping, though I couldn't really afford to even if I wanted, because I had to spend a lot of gold on resurrecting my mercenary. In the Claw Viper Temple, I actually stopped jumping and fought some enemies. I never deal with these nasty snakes unless I absolutely have to, especially in hell, but as I could actually tank and kill them fairly easily, I took some revenge for all the trouble they caused me in the past, and I savored every moment of it. Then I picked up the pace again, located the right tomb, and fought Duriel. This fight really showed me how big of a difference my shield made, because while having it equipped, the fight was easy, but I tried unequipping it to boost my damage, but then Duriel completely thrashed me. About 5 minutes later of whacking him with my sword, Duriel fell. In Act 3 there's a lot of fast and annoying enemies in the jungle, but thanks to Howl being a synergy to Berserk, it was maxed and I was very thankful for the large radius. I skipped most enemies in Act 3, but in Travancore I had to defeat the council to continue. I used the same strategy as in previous difficulties. I began by clearing out the surrounding areas of enemies to give myself some space to maneuver, and then I tried to pull them out a few at a time. But even when faced alone and with max resist and block, I had to disengage one of the elites for a little while to let my potions catch up to the damage I was taking, which was not a good sign for things to come. My defenses were enough to tank Mephisto comfortably though, so as soon as I got him alone, defeating him was easy. It didn't take as long as Duriel, but once again I tried to go two-handed to speed it up, but couldn't handle the heat. When he finally died a few minutes later, I couldn't believe my eyes. A green gothic armor and a green great helm, the final two pieces of Saigon's complete steel in the same drop. I would have had the complete set by now, well, if I hadn't sold all of the pieces that is. Granted, it was late in the game, so maybe it wouldn't have been that amazing, and I have been doing a bit of extra farming, but I have never found a complete set in a playthrough before. What a shame it happened in this particular one, as I wasn't able to benefit at all. In Act 4 I headed straight for the Chaos Sanctuary. I even skipped Isuel and the Hellforge for now, because now everything had become a real grind to kill, and I didn't think either would be that useful for me at the moment. Thanks to my defensive upgrades, my big life pool and my work rise, I was able to survive just fine in most situations except against elites with really nasty stats. But my damage was really starting to fall behind, and most fights against elites or groups of monsters ended up taking at least a couple of minutes, though I much preferred slow fights against tanky enemies to fighting the Oblivion Knights and their curses. Honestly, who thought that giving enemies a slowing curse would be a fun game mechanic? But the curses wouldn't be so bad if the knights themselves weren't such cowards. Trying to pin down Lord Disease was such an incredible pain, because he would cast Decrepify on me and then run away, over and over. During this fight I eventually completely ran out of money and had to start selling some of my spare runes just to be able to afford potions. I stopped reviving my mercenary at this point since it was just so expensive and he was not able to live long anyway against the knights. I was noticeably weaker without him though, not only as added damage, but the boost to my attack rating from enchant was really missing. The Chaos Sanctuary and Lord Disease in particular was by far the most difficult and frustrating challenge of this run so far, and since the Oblivion Knights are immune to both Howl and Taunt, I was not able to reliably separate them and control the battle leader, which I had relied on for all of hell so far. But eventually, with slow careful advancements and a lot of patience, I managed to clear out every seal. I finally got to face Diablo, and between my max block, my max resistances and his lightning attack going completely over my head, the 5 or so minutes it took to wear him down felt like a peaceful break after struggling so hard to get to this fight.
It would be too brief for you, Diablo.
Being completely out of gold, I knew I needed to stop and farm for a bit, because I anticipated that the end of Act 5 would be just as bad as the Chaos Sanctuary, if not worse. So I visited Eldritch also in Hell for what would hopefully be the final grinding session. Even in Hell, Eldritch is pretty easy to kill, so it didn't take too long to get a respectable gold pile. I only got a single additional level this time, but at least it was something. I then headed towards the Ancients as fast as possible. This challenge had been a lot of fun so far, but now I was mostly concerned with beating the final boss and finishing the game. The real test for this character was going to be the Ancients and Bale's throne room, not rescuing the barbarians from the frigid highlands. So I took my cowardly playstyle to the next level and didn't kill a single enemy from Eldritch all the way to the Ariat summit. I was planning to do sort of a scouting attempt at first to see what fighting them would be like. I went in with a full belt and a full inventory of potions, but no extra potions on the ground. I managed to separate one of them to be completely alone, which is rare for me. I took down Talik in a few minutes, but in the process I used up more than half of my potions. I had not been doing a good job of maximizing my potions against Talik, using them too early too often. This was partially because I was not expecting this try to be a success, and partially because it could deal damage in big bursts with Whirlwind, and I wanted to be on the safe side. I decided to see what I could do against the others, and while they didn't roll with anything too dangerous, Corlic spawned with Mana Burn. I ran in circles trying to separate the two again and actually managed to get one of them alone a second time. My mercenary died, but one-on-one Madoc was no match, and I didn't really expect him to be, as he is typically the weakest one. So now it was just Corlic, and had it not been for the mana burn, he would not have been a problem whatsoever, but thanks to his attacks draining all of my mana in a single hit, I was essentially fighting him with my normal attack. And without the attack rating boost from Berserk, as well as the enchant from my mercenary having ran out, I was really struggling to land any hits on him, and the ones that did hit dealt very little damage. It would also not have been a problem if I had prepared better by putting extra potions on the floor, but here I was, slowly draining my last few health potions. I was considering to reset the fight once I was down to only full rejuvenation potions, as I really wanted to save those for later, but I had also been in this fight for over 10 minutes now, so I decided to use the rejuves to try and finish him. I could always go and farm more on some easier elites if I needed to. The fight was a slow, grindy slog, with each of us rarely hitting the other. I tried to wait as long as possible before drinking each potion, and it ended up being extremely close a few times. After drinking my last potion, Corlic immediately got a few big hits in. I got down to 200 health and started running away. I had been in this fight for almost 20 minutes now, so I really did not want to start over. Corlic was low too, but he could potentially take me down in one more hit, while I would need at least a few attacks to take him down. I didn't see any other option, so I waited until I had the mana for one final battle cry and went in for a final fight to the death. And I emerged victorious. Wow, what an ending to that fight. It couldn't have been any closer than that. It shouldn't have been that close to begin with if I had just prepared better by bringing more potions, but that didn't matter now. I was just happy that I got the victory. Then I was on to the final stretch of the game. I skipped all of the Worldstone Keep and made it to the throne room without fighting a single enemy. The throne room had both Death Lords and Burning Souls, which can be a disaster, but luckily only a few of each had spawned inside of the actual throne room, so I could clean them up relatively easily. I refilled my potion supply, grabbed my mercenary, and engaged the first wave. The first wave was no problem. I taunted all of the minions over to me one at a time, and I even used Fine Potion on their corpses to prevent them from being resurrected. Wave 2 on the other hand proved to be a problem. I tried using the same strategy, but I couldn't use Fine Potion on the skeletons. The mummies are also immune to magic, meaning Berserk dealt no damage to them. I had Concentrate as a backup skill for this situation, but it was a painful fight because I had to isolate every single enemy, and my low damage when not using Berserk was barely enough to outdamage their high health regeneration, even with my mercenaries' help. But after a long drawn out fight, I eventually finished them off. Wave 3 was much easier. Howl made all the minions run around like crazy, not only preventing them from attacking me, but also from healing Bartok. And after Bartok was dead, I cleaned up the rest of them with little effort. Ventar spawned with some really nasty stats, and the Venom Lords are really tanky, but once again I was able to handle them thanks to Howl's ability to make every fight a one-on-one encounter. Again I took down the leader first, and then cleaned up the rest of them one at a time. And then the fight that I was most worried about in the entire game, Lister and the Minions of Destruction. Their high damage output and their knockback was of course a big worry, but I wasn't even sure if my damage was high enough to outpace their health regen. They are also immune to both Howl and Taunt, which meant that I had to be very careful when trying to pull them apart. My mercenary died right away and I didn't resurrect him because he kept attracting too many minions at once. I managed to get two of them separated and was able to slowly wear them down. And I really mean slowly. Excuse the poor camera work, but I needed to be pushed up against the wall and I didn't dare to move around because I was afraid to attract more enemies. I eventually took both minions down and next I lured out Lister himself together with another minion. And I'm not sure if it was because Lister put me in hit recovery more often or if the slow from his cold damage is more potent, but all of a sudden I didn't seem to be able to outdamage the regen anymore. I tried for several minutes, but I could barely put a dent on their health bar before they healed back up. I was kind of stumped on what to do now. I did not have any easy way to upgrade my gear in any meaningful way. Maybe upgrade my weapon, but shopping for an exceptional or elite base is so time consuming because they only show up occasionally, and then I would need a really good roll on top of that. After considering my options for a while, I eventually got another idea. I used the cube to remove the shale runes from my sword, and replaced them with another shale rune and the rune from the Nightmare Hellforge. With one less shale rune I would attack slower, meaning lower damage output, but the rune gave my weapon 25% chance to open wounds. Open wounds causes the target to start bleeding for some extra damage, but more importantly it completely stops their health regeneration. This turned out to be a great idea, and with their health regen gone, it was just a matter of time before I managed to kill Lister and then the remaining minions. It's easy to see with hindsight, but I really wish I had put the rune in the sword from the beginning, seeing how powerful it was. I started celebrating, because in my mind the challenge was over, but I really underestimated Bale, which was a lot tougher than I thought it would be. I was dealing very little damage to him, and in contrast to Normal and Nightmare, he was now dealing significant damage back to me as well. And my gold stash was completely empty, so I ended up having to sell almost all of my gems and runes to be able to afford enough potions, and I bought well over 100 potions just for this fight. This was a super fun challenge, pushing me to explore items that I would never have considered otherwise, and learning a lot about how magic and rare items work. But oh my god, what a grind hell was. In hindsight, I think I added a few too many rules to an already difficult challenge. Big respect to anyone who plays SSF Barbarians. Seriously, this was the slowest and grindiest individual fight yet, but to be honest, there's not much to say about this fight other than that I came a bit too close for comfort to running out of potions and gold completely. But finally, after just over 42 minutes after first entering the Wolfstone Chamber, I defeated Bale and finished the challenge. If you want more crazy Diablo 2 challenges, but like me have had enough of all this talk about gear and their stats for a while, check this video out where I attempt to beat the game without wearing any gear at all. If you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a member. Click the join button or the link in the description of the video for more information. And thank you for watching.